2601 Night Guides. Soon enough, Sunny found himself hiding in the shadows of a spacious chamber on one of the upper floors of the mainmast pagoda, not far below Jet's private garden. Jet herself was leaning back on a chair, looking out the window with a relaxed expression on her pale, radiant face. There was a knock on the door, and a few moments later, it opened, revealing a few familiar faces. Knave, Bloodwave, and Aether, the last saints of the fallen House of Knights. Sunny did not know the last one personally, but he had heard a lot of good things about the outstanding young man, who used to be the most promising scion of a great clan once. Well, technically speaking, Saint Aether wasn't that young anymore. If he was considered young, then so was Sunny, and Sunny did not feel like a young man at all. If anything, he felt ancient. He felt way too old to be dealing with all this crap. Ah, I suddenly feel for the captain of the homicide division, back in Mirage City. His questionable relationship with age was probably the consequence of living 7 lives at the same time and containing a legion of dead shadows in his soul. That, and the countless forgotten years he had spent in the tomb of Ariel. In any case, the House of Night had been absorbed into the government and was now a part of its forces. So, these 3 proud legacy saints were Jet's subordinates, which was a good thing, considering that they were the best candidates to solve the riddle that Weaver had left in the night sky. There were other surviving members of the House of Night bearing the title of Nightwalkers, but none were as powerful and knowledgeable as these 3. Jet smiled. Gentlemen, please, have a seat. They must have witnessed the celestial conflagration that had happened earlier, so there was little point in postponing the discussion. Sunny barely suppressed his curiosity, but before Jet could broach the topic, Bloodwave asked in a grim tone. Is it true, Soul Reaper? She glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. What, exactly, are you talking about? The 3 saints looked at each other. Eventually, it was Knave who spoke, his voice just as concerned as his uncle's. That monster, Mordred of Nowhere. Are the rumors true? He is a supreme now, and Lady Nephis strike a deal with him. The rumors seem to have reached the Night Garden, already. Hidden in the shadows, Sunny sighed. He himself was uncomfortable with the uneasy alliance between the human domain and Mordred. Few people trusted the King of Nothing, but no one had suffered from his wicked ways like the surviving members of the House of Night had. So, it was only natural that they would be unhappy with the news of his ascension to the throne of supremacy, let alone of the deal between him and Changing Star. Jet studied the Saints of Night with a neutral expression, then shrugged. It's true, they were dismayed. Even Aether, who usually maintained nearly flawless decorum, allowed emotion to show on his face. How can this be? The air in the room had turned noticeably chilly and heavy with tension. Jet let out a long sigh, then looked at them with a dark expression. Why, what did you want her to do? She leaned back and crossed her legs. Did you want her to start a new war, perhaps? It has not even been 2 years since the mess in Godgrave, but I guess another war between Supremes is just what we need. Knave frowned. That's a very callous way of looking at things, Jet. You know what that man has done, to us, and to all of humanity as well. Lady Nephis cannot trust him. He must be eradicated. Jet smiled darkly. I know, Knave, but I also know that he is immortal, supreme, wields a divine aspect, and inhabits millions of vessels. Who is going to eradicate him? You, me, or do you want Nephis to kill him, somehow, while we cheer her on from the sidelines? Knave gritted his teeth, unable to find an answer. In that silence, Bloodwave murmured in his deep voice. Is that such a big deal, though? She killed 2 Supremes before, and seemingly without much trouble. It was obvious he was simply venting, so no one took his words seriously. Sunny was a bit hurt, though. Hey, sure, from the sidelines, it must have looked like Nephis finished him off easily. But even if the whole thing had been an act, he still had his pride. Should I have resisted a bit more before being cut down? Sunny shook his head, then assumed a tangible form. Actually, she only killed 1 Supreme. Walking out from the shadows, he offered the Saints of Night a smile and sat down near Jet. Noticing their confusion, he then realized that they probably had no idea who he was. Oh, awkward. After all, very few people had known Master Sunless, and most of them had only seen him from afar on a calamitous battlefield. Well, apart from the regulars of the Eye Candy Cafe, the Radiant Emporium Cafe. In any case, for most, the Lord of Shadows was associated with his fearsome mask. The Saints of Night had not participated in the Godgrave military campaign, so they would have met either of his incarnations. So, Sunny smiled and offered helpfully. Oh, I am the Lord of Shadows. You can call me Lord Shadow, or simply Shadow. I also respond to the Dark Lord. Or Sunny. The three saints stared at him with wide eyes. Sunny's smile dimmed a little. He cleared his throat. As you can see, the news of my death was grossly exaggerated. Well, actually, I did die for a bit. But being dead grew old pretty quickly, so now I'm back. He remained silent for a few moments and then added in a light tone. So, as far as killing Supremes goes, Nephis and I are tied for first place. For now, we are. 2602 lost among the waves. Despite Sunny's friendly tone, the Saints of Night did not seem inclined to respond in kind. They stared at him with expressions of concerned apprehension, not saying anything. The silence was a little heavy. Eventually, they turned to Jet. Bloodwave was the one to speak first, his tone wary. Soul Reaper, what is the meaning of this? She met his gaze, held it for a few moments, then chuckled. Oh, relax. He's on our city. It probably looked like she was conspiring against Nephis with an old enemy who had mysteriously risen from the grave. The two of them shared that last part in common, strangely enough. And if Jet was conspiring against the Immortal Flame Clan, then it was safe to say that the government had secretly switched sides, as well. She was its de facto leader, after all. Obviously, Saints of Night would feel a great amount of apprehension, considering that they, their families, and all the survivors of the fallen Great Clan were part of the government now. It seemed that they did not wish to become traitors to the human domain, which warmed Sunny's heart a little. He shrugged. For reasons that I am not too keen on explaining, the Lord of Shadows had to be considered dead. So, Nephis and I pulled a little prank and convinced everyone that I died. In truth, however, we've been working side by side, very closely, I might add, ever since. One sovereign guides humanity in the sunlight, the other helps it from the shadows. Something like that. Granted, I am somewhat limited in what I can do. Looking at the grim faces of the three saints, he shook his head. Needless to say, you will need to keep my existence to yourself. I would not have revealed myself in front of you if I didn't believe that you could keep a secret, but still, it is worth saying aloud. Do not mention the fact that I am not entirely dead to anyone, please, including those you implicitly trust. Everyone will be safer that way. He lingered for a moment, studying their faces, then chuckled. No, but why do you look so glum? These are not at all the expressions of people who have just learned that humanity is actually twice as strong as they had believed. Knave shook his head slowly. I am sorry, Lord Shadow. Sunny, it's just a lot to take in. Sunny smiled, hiding his bitterness at not being recognized by his old war buddy. He forced himself to think about something else. Now that's a reaction. The daughters of Kisong had been so nonchalant about his stunning resurrection, except for Death Singer, who immediately proposed. I should probably be happy that none of these three is confessing, I guess. He sighed. Regarding that bastard, Mordred, believe me, I'd love to see him gone as well. However, what we want and what reality dictates do not always coincide. I understand your desire to exact revenge, but at the moment, attempting to dispose of him would only invite disaster. You lost family members to his machinations, but you also have family members left to protect. Considering that the world is literally coming undone as we watch, I suggest you concentrate on that. An uneasy silence settled in the meeting chamber. Knave, Bloodwave, and Ether wore somber expressions, but his words seemed to have reminded them what was at stake. Eventually, Ether spoke up, his voice quiet and reserved. Welcome back to the world of the living, Lord Shadow. To what do we owe the honor of hosting you aboard the Night Garden? The youngest of the three saints, at least, seemed to be ready to face reality. Sunny knew that Naive would follow suit, as well. He had his daughter to protect, after all. And if the two of them made peace with the current situation, Bloodwave would follow suit. He smiled faintly. I'm glad that you asked. In fact, I am searching for something that I believe will help us weather the storms ahead better. I thought that it would be hidden on the Night Garden, but as it turned out, there was only a clue to where I must go, or rather, a map. You've seen what happened to the sky, right? Knave nodded slowly. Of course. Everyone saw. Is that why we were called? He paused for a second and then smiled bitterly. I guess it makes sense. Who else but us? Jet looked at him with a hint of compassion and said in a neutral tone. Indeed. We think that the stars are showing a path to, somewhere. So, I need your help to read the constellations, to determine if it is indeed a map, as well as where it leads to. The three saints looked at each other. Strangely enough, they kept silent for a long time. Sunny did not think that they had a reason to refuse to help, and on top of that, they seemed to be quite friendly with Jet. Knave's daughter even treated her like an aunt. So, he was surprised at their hesitance. The reason why they had hesitated, however, surprised him even more. After a long while, Knave finally spoke, looking at Jet and Sunny with a complicated expression. It is a star map, without a doubt. As for where it leads to, there's no need to guess. We already know. Sunny and Jet looked at each other, surprise apparent on their faces. You know, Knave nodded slowly. The House of Night used to possess a map just like this one, a long time ago. It was one of the most important relics of our clan. Sadly, it disappeared along with our leader, Nightwalker. Bloodwave's face fell at the mention of the founder of the House of Night. Sunny scratched the tip of his nose. So where did the stars point? Knave inhaled deeply. They point to the Eternal City, a mythical place lost among the waves. That was where the Night Garden was built, and that is where the lineage of Storm God is hidden, as well. 2603 Immortal Abode. Sunny remained silent for a long while, a little confused by Knave's words. There was something strange about them. Eventually, he frowned. Wait, did you say that it is hidden there? Not that it was hidden. Knave looked at Ether and Bloodwave, then nodded. Yes, the lineage of Storm God is not like the rest. The rest of them, as far as we know, came from lineage memories that outstanding individuals, or possibly simply lucky ones, earned either in the first nightmare or while exploring the dream realm and conquering the first citadels of humanity. But the source of the lineage of Storm God is not a memory. It is a place. Sunny just stared at him in surprise. A faint smile appeared on Knave's face. After all, the existence of the House of Night is a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? As you might know, initially, it was an alliance of lesser clans populating the Stormsia, created in large part to answer the rising influence of powerful factions like Valor or Immortal Flame. There was no blood relation between the various families forming the House of Night, so how did we all come to share the lineage of Storm God? He coughed. I know that there are a lot of salacious rumors about Nightwalker, but no, he did not conceive children with women from each of the founding families. Although there have been countless internal marriages between the various branches of the House of Night since then, he only had one child of his own. A shadow briefly ran across his face. Knave paused for a few moments, then sighed. However, he did share the lineage of Storm God with the other founding families of the House of Night. To explain how it was possible, I will have to divulge the most guarded secrets of our clan. Would have asked you to keep it, but I guess it does not matter anymore, now that the House of Night is no more. Bloodwave grimaced at his words, but did not say anything. Ether, meanwhile, looked away with a wistful expression. Jet shook her head. The House of Night might not be an independent force anymore, but it still exists. Don't sell yourself short. Knave offered her a brief smile. Thank you for saying that. In any case, the House of Night and the Eternal City are inseparably intertwined, because that was where our clan was born. Back then, Nightwalker was sent to the Eternal City on his first winter solstice. Other sleepers were, as well, but he was the only one who survived, and the only reason he survived was because he fled the terrifying place aboard the Night Garden, which had been drifting in the waters nearby. Sunny raised an eyebrow. How dangerous is this Eternal City, exactly? Knave hesitated. Nobody knows for sure, because Nightwalker rarely spoke about it. He was not a very social person, in general. However, the greatest treasures of the House of Night all came from the Eternal City, the Night Garden, the lineage of Storm God, and the map charting the course back to its shores. He paused for a moment, and then looked at the stars beyond the window. As far as we know, the Eternal City used to be an immortal abode, a utopia that death could not reach, where enlightened beings lived in peace and prosperity for many years, reborn anew every time their bodies and souls grew frail with age. It was also a place where weary deities came to rest. That was a long time ago, though, nobody really knows what hides in the depths of the Eternal City today. Even Nightwalker himself only saw a few areas on its outer edges, the piers, the wharf, and the lighthouse. Sunny studied him with a curious expression. What about the lineage of Storm God, then? Where did he find out, and how did he share it with other people? Knave remained silent for a few moments, then looked at Bloodwave. I think my uncle will know better, since he was one of those who received the lineage directly. Bloodwave frowned, then let out a long sigh. Well, as that scoundrel Nightwalker told it, the lighthouse of the Eternal City is also a temple dedicated to Storm God. It does not shine with ordinary light. Instead, a star is trapped within it. That star is the source of the lineage. Anyone who finds their way to the eternal city and enters the lighthouse will be bathed in its silver light. They would be reborn as descendants of Storm God. He paused for a moment, and then added somberly. Or die. Many do. Nave nodded. Yes. Nightwalker entered the lighthouse and survived. He also received the lineage of Storm God, which eventually allowed him to escape the eternal city. Before escaping, however, he collected a bit of that starlight into a special memory. In the end, the memory made it possible for the founding members of the House of Night to receive the lineage, as well, even if a few of them perished in the process. Sunny inhaled deeply. Nave confirmed something that he suspected all along, that not just anyone was fit to receive the lineage of a god. Sunny had felt it himself, all those years ago, when absorbing blood weave, he had just barely survived the process, and that was despite possessing an innate affinity to fate, and therefore sharing some degree of kinship with Weaver. Not to mention wielding a divine aspect. Warden of Valor, Immortal Flame, Nightwalker, Ravenheart, and the Unknown Awakened who had inherited the lineage of Heart God to later pass it on to Astarion, each of them had been a special person. It was no coincidence that they had earned lineage memories, so it was no surprise that they survived using them. The founding members of the House of Night were different, though. Unlike those who received a lineage memory after being judged worthy of it by the spell, they, just like the daughters of Ki Song, were exposed to a divine lineage arbitrarily. To some of them, it had become a fatal gift, and those were already people sent to the Stormsia by the Nightmare spell, so they had to have possessed some degree of affinity to the various aspects of Storm God. What did that make Sunny, though? The drop of ichor gave me a lineage that eats other lineages. It seemed that, just like in all things, he had been both incredibly lucky and terribly unfortunate when receiving his lineage. Go figure. 2604 Mindset of a Sovereign. After remaining silent for a while, Sunny spoke in a contemplative tone. I am guessing that the starlight stolen by Nightwalker was not infinite, though. Nave nodded. Indeed. The light contained within the star lantern was merely a wisp, so it was exhausted eventually. Ether was the last person to have benefited from it directly. He paused for a moment, and then added in a complicated tone. Not every child born in the House of Night inherits the lineage, either. And with how often Awaki Ned die, our bloodline has always been at risk of vanishing. There are fewer of us now than ever before, and no one has been able to manifest the lineage as strongly as Nightwalker himself, yet. So, that was one of the reasons why he wanted to return to the Eternal City. He glanced around the spacious cabin they had gathered in, then gestured to its walls. The Night Garden is another. It is no secret to those who know it well that the Night Garden is in a state of disrepair. Some of its functions have deteriorated, while some have broken down entirely. It had been drifting in the Stormsia for thousands of years before being discovered by Nightwalker, after all. He believed that this great ship had been built at the wharf of the Eternal City, and therefore, that it could be repaired there, too. Sunny frowned faintly. He knew that the Night Garden had been built by the Demon of Repose. Did the Eternal City have a connection to her as well, then? It was quite possible that it did. A city where living things were reborn anew every time their bodies and souls grew decrepit with age, and were therefore unfamiliar with death, sounded very much like something that the demon-wielding powers of restoration and rejuvenation could have created. What the? Had the Demon of Repose not only sailed the seas on a luxurious ship, but also operated an exclusive resort? Sunny smelled a kindred spirit. Nave sighed. And lastly, Nightwalker only explored the outer fringes of the Eternal City before making his escape. The mystery of what was hidden in its depths, what treasures the immortals had left behind, had always drawn him back. So, he always intended to return there one day. Sunny hesitated for a moment. So why didn't he? He had the map. Bloodwave spoke instead of Nave, his deep voice betraying a hint of unease. Because he only escaped those waters by miracle, the first time around. People tend to think of the Stormsia as just another region of the Dream Realm, but actually, it is as vast as the rest of the explored area of this cursed world, encompassing waters that are as different from each other as Godgrave is different from the lawn in front of Bastion. He smiled darkly. We humans are able to exist in some parts of the Stormsia, but that does not mean that we can sail it freely and go wherever we want. In fact, those who are not careful to stay in relatively safe waters all die terrible deaths. And among those who do steer clear of the more perilous parts of the Stormsia, only some die. Nave nodded. The Eternal City is hidden in the very heart of the Stormsia, so even with a map, reaching it is a dangerous task, at least it was, in the times when Nightwalker lived. You must remember that the most powerful of his contemporaries were only masters, back then. Still, he never abandoned the plan of returning to the Eternal City, one day. Sunny and Jet looked at each other. Was that where he vanished? Did he leave on a voyage to the Eternal City and never come back? Nave remained silent for a while. Yes, some say that he died while exploring the Dream Realm, some say that he perished while attempting to conquer the third nightmare, but the truth is that Nightwalker left on a voyage to return to where he had first entered the Dream Realm. No one has heard anything about him since. Sunny frowned. Nave believed that Nightwalker had vanished without a trace while attempting to reach the Eternal City, and that no one knew what had happened to him, but that was not entirely true. Mordred knew something, it seemed. At least he let slip that Astarion had forcefully taken the lineage of Storm God from Nightwalker, which led Sunny to believe that the Dreamspawn had something to do with the disappearance of the founder of the House of Night, even if the details of their confrontation, as well as its timing, were murky. In any case, Nave had given him a lot to think about. After a long bout of silence, Sunny asked in a reserved tone. So what you're saying is that there is a wondrous city, no doubt the most monstrous hell imaginable, by now, lost somewhere in the Stormsia, full of mystical treasures and divine light. Not only does it hold the key to restoring the bloodline of Storm God, but there's also a wharf there where the Night Garden can be returned to its true glory. And the map to that city has just become visible to everyone in the Stormsia just now. Nave nodded cautiously. Sunny hesitated for a while, then looked at Jet. He stared at her for a moment. So, we are going there, right? She did not seem to share his enthusiasm, though. Sunny, are you asking me if I am willing to take my ship, complete with millions of people living aboard it, on an expedition to who knows where, knowing full well that there will definitely be untold horrors waiting for us along the way? Sunny scratched the back of his head. Yes. Jet shook her head slowly. Why would we take that risk? Hearing that, Ether nodded. I agree. It is too perilous, even if the rewards promised by that expedition are great. Nave and Bloodwave remained silent, but they seemed to share his opinions at least to some degree. Sunny looked at them with dark amusement. Why? He shook his head with a wry smile. Well, it's easy, really. Actually, I am quite surprised that I, a sovereign, have to spell it out for you. Leaning forward, he looked at Jet and the Saints of Night with no hint of humor in his eyes. It is because I am desperate. Nephis does not show it, but she is desperate, too. You don't seem to be nearly desperate enough, though, despite being weaker than us while knowing that the world is ending. There is barely any time left before all kinds of cursed and unholy beings descend upon us and consume us all. But you want to pass on a chance to increase the collective strength of humanity, and by a large margin at that. He leaned back and took a deep breath. Allow me to dispel your illusion, then. Being cautious is great, but caution is a luxury we cannot afford. The time for caution is long gone, it had been squandered entirely before any of us was even born. Our only inheritance is necessity, and necessity dictates that we must take risks, whether we like it or not. Jet stared at him for a long while, her icy blue eyes betraying no emotion. Eventually, she sighed. Is that the mindset of a sovereign? Sunny smiled. Being desperate. Oh, it is. No one becomes supreme by living a good life. Believe me, I am the most honest person in the world, after all. 2 worlds, even, 2605 risk and reward. Sunny meant what he had said to Jet and the Saints of Night. Their situation was indeed day row or rate. The end of days was swiftly approaching, and the fate of humanity was woefully undecided. Perhaps the rest could ignore that ominous truth, but as one of the Supremes, Sunny was personally responsible for what would happen to the world in the end. So, unlike those who wielded less power, he could not allow himself the solace of willful ignorance. Things would have been easier if I could. He missed the time when all he worried about was making enough credits to fill his belly and live a lavish life. Well, that, and surviving another day in a world where everything seemed both unfathomably powerful and hell-bent on killing him, somehow. In any case, Sunny could not allow himself excessive caution. That said, he was not suggesting that they had no room for caution at all. He had merely pointed out that their choices were limited and that erring on the side of caution when calculating risk and reward was a luxury they could not afford. Sunny was not advocating for complete recklessness, though. He had valid reasons to believe that an expedition to the Eternal City would be successful, or, at the very least, not end in disaster. There were several factors mitigating the risk of following the star map. First and foremost, there was the Night Garden itself. The living ship had spent thousands of years drifting in the Stormsia, and nothing had managed to sink it yet, so, Sunny believed that it could weather any danger they would face on the voyage to the Eternal City. Even if they did stumble onto something too terrifying, though, there was one thing that the Night Garden was better at than almost any other citadel: it was escaping danger. Not only was the Titanic ship highly mobile in and of itself, but there was also the ability to open the Dream Gate between 2 points in the Dream Realm that it granted Nephis. Should the need arise, the Night Garden would be able to retreat to safer waters almost in an instant. That way, the safety of its passengers could be ensured. Sunny did not want to risk millions of lives, after all. He would not have suggested taking the Night Garden into perilous waters if he was not reasonably certain that they would have a reliable way to protect its passengers. And lastly, there was the fact that Nightwalker had escaped the Eternal City once. Not only that, but he had managed to escape it as a sleeper. Now, an army of seasoned awakened warriors would be heading there, led by 3 saints of the House of Night and Soul Reaper Jet herself. Most importantly of all, there was Sunny. And Sunny alone was the equivalent of having 7 sovereigns, a cohort of supreme shadows, and a vast army of undying shades guarding the Night Garden on its journey. If that was enough to reap the rewards of the Eternal City, then what was? And those rewards promised to be bountiful, indeed, for Sunny, for the Night Garden, and for humanity at large. So, he judged that the risk presented by the expedition to the Eternal City was more than worth it. Of course, Sunny was not going to make that decision unilaterally. In truth, he did not really need the Night Garden to follow the map left behind by Weaver, he just needed someone capable of reading it to accompany him. It was just that the Eternal City offered an opportunity to strengthen the living ship, as well. If not for that, Sunny would have preferred to venture into the misty waters alone. Regardless, Jet and Sunny needed to consult Nephis and Cassie before deciding whether to take the Night Garden into the depths of the Stormsia. Preparations for a lengthy voyage also had to be made, so a few days passed in discussions and strategic meetings. Nephis was busy beyond belief, too. Cassie and she were still dealing with the fallout from Mordred's unexpected rise to the throne of supremacy. There was the public reaction to deal with, but also the King of Nothing himself. He and his countless vessels had to be allowed passage to the Hollow Mountains, and someone had to make sure that things did not go awry in the process. So, after many years, Mordred had returned to the Chained Isles. There, the members of the White Feather clan escorted him and Nephis to the Northern edges of the region, where the Night Temple had once stood. A new crossing was built to breach the wide divide between the floating islands and the misty slopes of the Hollow Mountains, which Mordred then used to leave the territory of the human domain behind and claim ownership of his own. At the same time, the eastern quadrant had to be salvaged now that the Skinwalker was gone. Troops had to be transported to other flashpoints, and on top of that, powerful nightmare creatures stirred in the death zones south of Godgrave. So, Nephis and the Fire Keepers were in the process of preparing for a military expedition, as well. In the end, it was decided that the expedition to the Eternal City had to happen. While the preparations were being made, Sunny pulled the Shadow Legion back from the depths of the burned forest. He wanted to consolidate his position on its southern outskirts and secure his new citadel in case of a potential attack, but more than that, he wanted his army to be free and ready to be deployed on the shores of the Eternal City, if need be. The same went for his other incarnations. After experiencing 2 deadly adventures while not having access to his full power, Sunny was dead set on meeting the dangers of the Eternal City armed to the teeth. About a week after the initial meeting with the Saints of Night, the same people gathered in the private council cabin of the mainmast pagoda once again. This time, they had more practical issues to discuss. How bad will this particular adventure turn out, I wonder? 2606 DG Eatful beings. We are self-sufficient in numerous areas, but food production still lags behind the consumption rate, despite the special influence of the Night Garden on soil and flora. So, the latest shipment of provisions was increased to account for unexpected delays during the journey, not that we know for sure how long sailing to the Eternal City will take. What about those special seeds from Ravenheart? I thought we were supposed to receive one of the first batches. Those are not ready to be planted yet. Apparently, the latest strains are too aggressive, whatever that means. Well, if Bliss says so. I assume we also stocked up on medical supplies, household items, and so on. Yes, but what about the consequences of your absence, Jet? Won't it have a negative effect on the situation in the northern and western quadrants? The old man is still alive and kicking. Effie and Kai can pick up the slack, as well. In any case, we received some breathing room because of what had happened in Australia, so I might as well take a vacation. Gods know I need a break. Jet. Break. Sunny smiled faintly, listening to their conversation. At that moment, Ether, who had remained similarly quiet, spoke up from his seat. I think we are overlooking an important issue. The rest of them glanced at him, somewhat surprised. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What issue is that? Ether considered his words for a few seconds, then gestured to the night sky visible through the open window. The stars. The journey to the Eternal City was hazardous because of where it is located, but only those who possessed a map knew where to go. Now, however, the stars charting a path to the Eternal City are visible to anyone who can look up at the sky. And anything. Sunny frowned faintly. Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting? The youngest of the Saints of Night nodded. Yes, Lord Shadow. We are willing to risk the dangers of the Stormsia because of the treasures hidden in the Eternal City, as well as the great secrets that mystical place holds. But will we be the only ones lured by its promise? I don't think so. Sunny blinked a couple of times. So we'll have competition? Ether shrugged. That is what I would assume. After all, why would powerful nightmare creatures not want to get their claws on a city that was once populated by immortals? All the things that we want to find there are the things they would want to consume, desecrate, or make their own. Leaning forward a little, the young saint said in a quiet voice. You showed us a way to the Eternal City when you ignited the stars, Lord Shadow. But I am afraid that you also began a race among those who can interpret the celestial map, and the participants of that race would not hesitate to tear each other to shreds to make sure that they get to the prize first. So, this expedition is going to be even more hazardous than it was supposed to be, since we will have to contend against alarming beings making the same journey. Sunny remained silent for a while, then leaned back with a concerned expression. Eventually, he sighed. Ah, but you are forgetting something, Saint Ether. A pale smile split his face apart. I am a terrifying being myself. I just have better manners. Sunny was not boasting, simply stating a fact. If he considered his powers separately from his personality, they painted the picture of quite an eldritch horror. Nefi's was largely the same, if not more frightening. Wait, come to think of it. Sunny's personality was not that great, either. He remained silent for a few seconds, staring into the distance with a strange expression. Anyway, moving on. In any case, Sunny was not too worried. Which was not to say that he was not taking Ether's theory seriously. Looking around, he lingered a little, then asked in a neutral tone. Does the Night Garden carry some kind of armaments? Like cannons or enchanted siege engines? Jet smiled lazily. The ship itself is a living armament, but no, it does not. In theory, we are its armaments, Knave, Ether, Bloodwave, and I. As well as awakened and ascended warriors stationed aboard. Sunny hummed in contemplation. So, it is more of a carrier than a battleship. It made sense. A saint was far more capable and could deliver far more damage than any siege engine ever could, enchanted or not. So, if there was something that the hull of the living ship could not handle itself, its transcendent passengers were there to solve the problem. With a Supreme aboard, the firepower that the passengers of the Night Garden could unleash would increase tenfold. The problem was that Sunny could not reveal himself openly. He considered his options for a short while, then shook his head. That is good and all, but having a few powerful cannons never hurts. You were in Falcon Scott, weren't you? I hear the railguns on its walls were quite something. Jet's relaxed smile turned a few hues darker. Yes, I was. And yes, mundane armaments were of great help, not that it mattered, in the end. The Saints of Night had guided plenty of naval convoys in the waking world, so they were well acquainted with the benefits of having powerful armaments as well. Knave gave Sunny a confused look. Where would we find enchanted siege engines, though? Ones worthy of the Night Garden, no less. I don't think those are just laying around, unused. Sunny shrugged with a smile. There's no need to search for them. I'll just forge them. He was currently developing vast defensive spells to reinforce the citadels of humanity, aided by Cassie. Arming the Night Garden was not entirely the same, but it would serve the same purpose. Plus, the idea of making a huge, destructive magical cannon made Sunny excited. His smile widened. Yeah, let me scrounge something up. 2607 Naval Engagement. Several weeks later, the battered Night Garden flew across the waves as the sea foamed and boiled around it. Space was unpredictable in the Stormsia, and time was unpredictable as well. Day was sometimes so short that it could be missed in the blink of an eye, while night often overstated its welcome. Most of the time, however, the vast expanse of undulating water was shrouded in twilight, with pale stars shimmering in the distant sky. At the moment, though, the Stormzea was bathed in sunlight, with not a cloud in sight. There was no wind, no storm was coming to unleash its fury on the night garden. Despite that, the sea was turbulent and eerie, the water foaming as it seethed and roiled all around the living ship, as far as the eye could see. There were terrifying scars marring the hull of the night garden, slow to heal despite the ancient vessel's startling ability to mend itself. The civilians were safely sheltered below the main deck and remained in the sprawling vertical city hidden there. While martial law was in effect, so only awakened soldiers and ascended officers were in sight. That had become the norm over the last few weeks, as the Night Garden had engaged in countless battles and clashes with the nightmare creatures rushing to reach the Eternal City. All of Stormzea seemed to have gone mad once the celestial map was revealed, but now that they were getting closer to the goal, only the most dreadful contenders remained in the race. Captain, it's surfacing. In the runic hall of the main pagoda, Jet gave one of her subordinates an amused look. Captain, if memory serves, I was a lieutenant general last time somebody bothered to formally promote me. Shouldn't you fools call me an admiral, at least? The man blushed, embarrassed by her calm tone. Sorry, ma'am. But that thing, He did not get to finish the sentence, though, because at that moment, the foaming sea seemed to move. At first, it seemed as if two towering waves swelled on both sides of the ship. Then, however, the water continued to rise, as if the sea was pregnant with two towering mountains. A few heartbeats later, the surface tension broke, and two gargantuan tentacles burst from the depths into the vast expanse of the sky. Each was at least half a dozen kilometers long, and that was only what was visible of them above the surface. Who knew how deep they stretched into the abyssal depths of the bottomless sea? And who would want to know what was hidden there, in the depths? The colossal tentacles rose from the sea like two black cliffs, casting their shadows on the night garden. Port and starboard, fire! Jet did not raise her voice, but somehow, it could be clearly heard despite the roaring of water and the howling of the wind. A signal was given, and a few seconds later, the cannons stationed along the sides of the Titanic ship thundered. There were 24 of these cannons in total, 12 per side, and each of them was a colossal beast. The cannons were 12 meters in length and more than 2 meters in diameter, firing iron balls that were almost as tall as a person and weighed so much that only Ascended could load them into the barrels. The cannons were not cast from metal, but rather carved from seemingly indestructible black stone, their surface engraved with intricate carvings. When Jet asked where that material came from, Sunny simply said that he borrowed some obsidian from the Shadow Realm. She was still not sure whether he was joking or not. And when she asked what function the engravings served, he gave her a peculiar look and told her that they were there to make the cannons look pretty. That, he seemed to have been deadly serious about. That man. In any case, the cannons were enchanted with simple, but ingenious magic. They were able to absorb soul essence and then convert it into kinetic energy to propel the cannonballs with devastating force. The projectiles themselves were charged with essence, as well. That way, they were able to wound even nightmare creatures of high ranks. Of course, while only the quantity of essence mattered when charging the cannons, which meant that they could be operated by crews of awakened, it was the quality of essence that mattered when infusing the cannonballs. So, if the Night Garden faced abominations of the corrupted rank or higher, a master had to be in charge of the artillery crew to make the shots count. Or better yet, a saint. Sadly, the transcendent defenders of the Night Garden had better things to do than run around fueling cannons with their essence, and the nightmare creatures they faced on this particular expedition were often of the great rank, instead. However, the Lord of Shadows had thought of a solution for that, as well. To solve the problem, he designed The cannons in a way that allowed them to consume essence not only from awakened, but also from soul shards. And, luckily enough, he seemed to possess literal thousands of transcendent soul shards, at the moment, the spoils from the conquest of the Burden Forest, no doubt. These soul shards had been distributed among the government soldiers aboard the Night Garden, resulting in a significant increase in their overall power. These days, there was hardly any awakened or ascended here without a fully saturated core. The remaining shards were assigned to the cannon crews, and were being used to feed powerful Essence into the cannonballs. As the cannons thundered, colossal orbs of shining metal streaked through the air and tore into the colossal tentacles. Enormous chunks of flesh and torrents of oily black liquid filled the air, and one of the tentacles folded under its own weight, falling back into the waves. The aim of the starboard cannoneers fell short of the mark. though, and the second tentacle continued to rise above the night garden. When its colossal shadow fell upon the living ship, Jet glanced up with a concerned expression. Brace. As the enormous tentacle fell, wrapping itself around the night garden, 4 more rose from the foaming sea. 2,608 3 serpents and a whale. The night garden shook as the colossal tentacle fell from the sky, wrapping itself around it. The invisible shield protecting the deck of the living ship from the fury of storms prevented it from wreaking havoc across the superstructures, and it avoided skewering itself on the tall masts. As well, however, the vessel still ended up captured in a dreadful embrace, the hull groaning as unimaginable pressure descended upon it. The tentacle constricted, trying to crush the night garden into splinters and pull it under the waves. Jet did not seem too concerned, however. Looking at the southern horizon, where a strange haze was gathering above the sea, she frowned slightly. Reload the cannons. Divination team, I need a weather forecast as soon as possible. The chain of nightmares had been a disaster to awakened wielding powers of divination, who became far less capable in its wake. However, they still had their uses, and some seemed to have been affected less than others. Nightfall is imminent. Jet's frown deepened a little. How imminent? Her question was met with silence. But even those who were affected less were far from precise. The sea boiled as 4 gargantuan tentacles rose from it, and the hull of the night garden groaned as the 5th one constricted around it. Jet pursed her lips. Ah, I think I am starting to hate water, too. At that moment, 2 human figures plummeted from the great height of the living ship's main deck, flying toward the water. The fall would have undoubtedly killed anyone below the transcendent rank on impact, but these 2 simply dove into the waves. A heartbeat later, 2 massive shadows moved under the weight G, rushing toward the gargantuan tentacles. They were Knave and Bloodwave, the saints of the fallen House of Night, who had assumed their transcendent forms. Jet looked at her shadow. She was sure that a subtle presence was hiding in it before, but now, the shadow felt empty. The Sovereign of Death seemed to have departed to join the battle, as well. There, below the waves, he could unleash his power without being seen. So, Jet shuddered to imagine the horror of what would happen in the depths before too long. She glanced south. There, far away, the mist was gathering. Far below the night garden, in the murky depths, Sunny was hidden in Knave's shadow. The water was boiling around them, and the gargantuan shapes of the black tentacles rose from the vast darkness below like long stalks of some abyssal flower, twisting and swaying as they stretched toward the surface. Bloodwave had assumed the shape of a grotesque killer whale, his giant body moving through the water with chilling ferocity. The enormous blue eyes of the great predator suddenly ignited with an ominous red glow. In the next moment, the sea around them was painted in hues of crimson, and the frightening presence of the oldest surviving saint of night became even more daunting. As much as the shape of Bloodwave was enormous, however, Knave almost dwarfed him. Having turned into a colossal sea serpent, he rushed toward a different tentacle with terrifying speed. It was not just that the serpent was swift, rather, water itself parted to let him pass and flowed in the direction he chose, supporting his feral charge. Due to his transcendent form and the nature of his aspect, Knave reminded Sunny of the Serpent King sometimes. There were a lot of similarities between their transformations, but there were subtle differences as well. Sunny had not noticed it before, but now that he had observed Knave closer, he realized that the gorgeous scales of his transcendent form were actually formed from glacial ice. In fact, he suspected that Knave's entire transcendent form was made not from flesh, but from various shapes of altered and finely controlled water. So, in a sense, the gorgeous sea serpent was not a ferocious beast. Instead, it was a hydraulic death machine in the form of a mystical aquatic monster. It did not make Knave any less fearsome, though. Just as his maw opened, glistening with a palisade of razor-sharp icy fangs. Sunny judged that they were deep enough for his arrival to remain unnoticed. He allowed himself to slide off Knave's azure scales and then summoned a torrent of shadows from the shadow lantern. In the next moment, a gargantuan serpent forged from onyx and darkness roared under the vast mass of restless water, making the sea ripple and boil. His tenebrous form far surpassed that of both Knave and Bloodwave in size, casting a shadow so deep that it felt darker than the lightless expanse of the abyssal depths. And in that shape stirred. As Sunny tore through the mass of water in the shell of the onyx serpent, Soul Serpent separated from him and rushed the other way, moving with chilling grace in the crimson darkness of the Stormsia. Snakes everywhere. Sunny felt a hint of vicious glee as he, Serpent, Knave, and Bloodwave each tore into one of the gargantuan tentacles. The distressing violence of it all was simply beyond comprehension. The water boiled, rivers of oily black blood spilled into its depths, grotesque pieces of shredded flesh slowly sank into the darkness, and annihilating shockwaves rolled through the water, causing towering waves somewhere far above. Well, naturally the violence was harrowing. There were two transcendent descendants of Storm God and two supreme titans assaulting the unknown horror of the depths. After all, it was difficult to imagine a calamity on a larger scale than that. The twisting tentacles were too gargantuan and tough to be torn apart, though. Even Sunny, with the prodigious size of his shell, could not bite one in two, far from it. So, instead, he tore into his target, shredding it and ripping huge chunks of flesh out. As black blood clouded the water around him, slowly melting the impregnable barrier of the jade mantle, he felt the tentacle weaken. The goal was to deal enough damage to make it collapse under its own weight. If enough muscle tissue was torn and shredded, the horror of the depths would not be able to control the tentacle anymore, and would therefore be forced to pull it back into the abyssal depths. The problem with that, however, was that it wasn't easy to continuously attack the same spot on the swaying, twisting tentacle, and if they were not careful, they would be caught and crushed by the thing they were meant to hurt. Sunny, Serpent, and the Saints of Night were managing fine, though. After all, it was not the first time the Night Garden was attacked by this particular horror. They had battled it several times before, and each time, they managed to drive it back. The soldiers aboard the living ship had even given the terrifying depth dweller a nickname, calling it Old Tom. Sunny was not sure about the naming sense. Personally, he could have undoubtedly come up with something far superior, but it did not really matter what the terrifying dweller of the depths was called. Today, Sunny wanted to accomplish something more than simply repelling Old Tom back into the depths from which it had come from. As each of the four shredded tentacles retreated into the dark depths, he let out a low growl. And then followed them down into the abyss. Knave, Bloodwave, and Serpent did, as well. Soon, all light disappeared from the vast expanse of cold water around them, and they found themselves in utter darkness. 2,609 deadly racers. Back on the surface, the four tentacles plummeted into the water and disappeared from view. The fifth, meanwhile, was still straining to crush the Night Garden in its awful embrace. The living ship refused to shatter, though. Instead, at the points where the gigantic tentacle was wrapped around its hull, Old Tom's flesh seemed to boil, and torrents of oily blood flowed down the surface of the weathered wood, painting it black. But soon enough, the coating of black blood was absorbed into the Night Garden, as well, and it regained its original color. The titanic struggle continued for some time, and then, the dark tentacle shuddered. It tried to extricate itself from the living ship, but the hull of the Night Garden would not let it go. In an eerie change of pace, the previous situation seemed to have been reversed. Instead of trying to crush the ancient vessel, the immense tentacle was now straining in an attempt to escape. Slowly, the revolting flesh of the mysterious horror ripped, and finally, the tentacle tore itself free of the wooden hull, not without leaving enormous chunks of flesh behind, though. With all its underside skinned and stripped of a layer of flesh, the tentacle whipped into the air, raining black blood upon the sea. Convulsing, it then retreated into the surging waves and disappeared from view. A new scar was added to the hull of the Night Garden, with pieces of the gigantic tentacle slowly sinking into the surface of the living wood. The ancient vessel was going to consume Old Tom's flesh like it had that of countless nightmare creatures before, and use these nutrients to mend whatever damage the horror of the depths dealt it. Granted, the previous scars left on the hull of the Night Garden by Old Tom were slow to heal, still marring its surface. Another tentacle was already rising from the foaming water, but despite that, Jet let out a relieved sigh. Old Tom was one of the most persistent contenders in the race to the Eternal City. Countless of the abominations they had clashed with during this dangerous voyage had already perished, either slain by humans or torn apart by fellow nightmare creatures, but this harrowing creature continued to follow the Night Garden like a curse, attacking it from the depths from time to time. Hopefully, the Lord of Shadows and the Saints of Night would destroy it today, or, if not, then at least gather information about what Old Tom actually was. No one had seen the source of the terrifying tentacles, since it was hidden too deep. The horror of the depths was not what Jet was worried about, though. The mist is coming. Cursing quietly, she looked south. There, the eerie haze had already 2G-ned into a rolling wall of ghostly mist. Cold winds suddenly assaulted the Night Garden, and the wall of mist moved across the surface of the water, slowly devouring the world. Jet studied it with a tense expression, and so did everyone else in the runic hall. Far below, on the main deck, the soldiers charging the cannons stopped, as well, watching the approaching mist with pale faces. Will it come? As if to answer Jet's question, a massive shadow moved in the mist. A dead silence enveloped the night garden as everyone looked south with wary expressions. Then, the silhouette of an eerie ship slowly revealed itself in the fog. Although not quite as titanic as the night garden, it was still enormous, towering above the sea like a fortress built of rotten wood. Its tattered sails swayed slowly in the ghostly winds, and an eerie glow emanated from its broken, deserted deck. The ship looked almost translucent, as if it was there and not there at the same time. It moved at the edge of the rolling wall of mist, looking like it was guiding it. Dutchman. It's the Dutchman. Just then, the ghostly shapes of smaller vessels revealed themselves from the veil of fog, being drawn by the same ethereal winds that carried the Dutchman. That was what the soldiers had named the flagship of the ghostly fleet. Jet wasn't sure what an old tale from before the dark times had to do with abominable nightmare creatures of the Stormsia, but the nickname stuck. Diviners. Nightfall within half an hour, ma'am. Jet closed her eyes for a moment. Half an hour, huh? Half an hour was a long, long time. Move the starboard cannons to port. Pull the awakened soldiers below deck. Send all ascended officers to the battlements. Summon every echo we have. Ether, the bridge is yours. You know what to do. Ether gave her a guardedly worried look, then bowed slightly. Yes, Lady Jet. Jet blinked a few times. Single quote. Right, I'm a lady now. Smiling crookedly, she raised her arms above her head and stretched like a cat, then let out a long sigh and summoned the mist blade. Commanding it into the shape of a war scythe, Jet then took a step forward and turned into a torrent of mist herself. Descending from the height of the mainmast pagoda, she rushed across the great span of the night garden's main deck and reached its edge. There, the awakened soldiers were already eating hastily, while the ascended cursed as they pushed the heavy cannons into place. Flowing upward, Jet returned to her corporeal form on top of one of the great cannons, standing at the very edge of its long obsidian barrel. The water foamed and surged far below her. Placing the scythe on her shoulder, Jet looked south, at the eerie shape of the Dutchman. A few moments later, she felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that someone, or something, was looking back at her. She raised a hand with a faint smile and beckoned the captain of the Dutchman with her finger, inviting him to come. In the next moment, the sails of the ghostly flotilla swelled, and dozens of rotting ships tore free of the wall of mist, flying across the waves toward the night garden. Come, you bastards. I was hungry, anyway. 2610 Wraith Armada. Jet could have sensed the advance of the ghostly armada even with her eyes closed. That was because the moment the captain of the Dutchman commanded his spectral fleet to sail forth, the winds vanished, plunging the world into a dead calm. All around the night garden, the water was restless because of the harrowing battle happening in the depths, but further away, it turned still and glass-like, reflecting the boundless sky like a vast mirror. There was no wind, and yet, the wall of mist continued to roll forward from the south, slowly devouring the world. The sails of the ghostly ships were swelling, and the ethereal vessels flew forward across the still surface of the motionless sea. The tentacles of the old Tom rose from the water on one side of the night garden, while from the other, the Wraith Armada swiftly shortened the distance, ghostly fires igniting on the dimly glowing decks. Jet grimaced. They just had to attack at the same time, damn it. But then again, maybe they did. The race to the Eternal City was coming to an end, after all. They were no more than a day or two away from reaching the finish line. Countless contenders had perished along the way, and only the strongest ones remained. Old Tom, the Dutchman, and the Night Garden were among those. Today was their last chance to dispose of the competition, so it was no wonder that the horror of The Depths and the nebulous wraith commanding the Dutchman chose to attack. Honestly, if Jet had a reliable way of tracking either of these foes, she would have been tempted to hunt them down herself. She and the Lord of Shadows had already eradicated Moji and a few rival contenders that way, leaving the waters of the Stormsia red with blood. Fire. Ether's command was relayed to the cannon crews, and the Ascended activated the enchantments of the great siege weapons. Jet took a step back and braced herself as the obsidian barrel beneath her shuddered and roared, sending an enormous ball of luminous iron flying forward with harrowing speed. The force unleashed by the sorcery of the Lord of Shadows was so terrible that the enormous cannon, weighing hundreds of tons, rolled a few meters back. It would have rolled further, too, if not for black chains that kept it in place. Jet easily maintained her balance on top of it, watching the radiant cannonball streak across the sky. The thunderous roar of 24 of these cannons firing in quick succession was both deafening and violent, but she endured the palpable sonic shock of it as well. It was like music to her ears. A powerful gale of wind sent her raven black hair dancing, and her icy eyes glowed with chilling blue light through the chaos of the devastating salvo. A few moments later, the cannonballs struck the ethereal ships. Some missed their marks, plunging into the sea and sending towering plumes of foaming water into the air, but the rest had been aimed true. A dark smile illuminated Jet's pale face. At least a dozen of the ghostly vessels were severely damaged, a few of them even dissolving into halos of ghastly, ephemeral light, as if dispelled by the violent force of the sorceress bombardment. Sadly, the Wraith Armada was an insidious enemy. Both the ships and the bloodthirsty ghosts populating them were spectral in nature, so only those attacks that targeted the intangible could harm them. The annihilating physical force carried by the radiant cannonballs was wasted on the ghastly fleet of restless souls. However, the soul essence that the cannonballs had been charged with could still wreak havoc among the spectral ships, even if the damage was not as destructive as it could have been. Several ships were dispelled, and several more slowed down, damaged by the bombardment. Reload the cannons. Jet evaluated the speed of the Wraith Armada and the remaining distance between the fastest ship and the Night Garden. The cannons were powerful, but it took time to saturate them with essence, not to mention the laborious process of loading new cannonballs into the enormous barrels. There was no time for the second salvo. The eerie form of the Dutchman loomed in. The mist behind the Armada, towering above the advancing ships like a lumbering beast. Drawing closer, Jet did not even know if the vessels the bombardment dispelled were truly gone, or simply returned to their source and would be summoned again later. The Night Garden had seen the Wraith Armada from a distance a few times and clashed with it once, but back then, the Dutchman had not seemed inclined to commit its forces to a full-scale battle. Perhaps its owner had been wary of the dead captain of the Night Garden and the ghostly monarch she was hosting aboard her ship, seeing a perverse kinship between them. Or, maybe, he simply saw no reason to bother. But now, the Wraith Armada was descending upon the living ship in full force. Want to board my ship, huh? Jet exhaled slowly, then changed the grip on her war scythe. A moment later, she leaned forward and sent it flying with a throw as powerful as what the great cannon beneath her was capable of. At the same time, she turned into a torrent of mist and wrapped herself around the ice-cold blade, riding it across the sky toward the advancing Armada. Her aim was true. The war scythe bit into the spectral deck of the leading vessel, causing the glow of the entire ship to dim. Jet assumed her human form and stepped onto the rotten wood, placing her hand on the trembling shaft of the mist blade. How about I board yours, instead? All around her, ethereal figures rose from the ephemeral glow, the ghastly shapes of dead sailors still bound to their sunken ship, knowing no peace or solace. Looking at them with a chilling hunger, Jet grinned. The Dutchman commanded a fleet of restless souls. And now, he had delivered them to Soul Reaper.